Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee, and I'll prove to you guys this is real coffee. People accuse me of fake coffee. You can hear it, you can see it, but you know it could be decaf, so I could be lying. But on to the point, before I get my day going and get my breakfast, my squats, everything done. Someone had asked me a question in my own training video yesterday of why is it that I think I can increase my press, but my bench is going to be stagnant while I'm losing weight right now. It's a great question, and this can segue into the entire topic of body weight gain and loss in the bench press, because the bench press is an interesting lift, and anyone who's been around the training world for a long time realizes that gaining weight is usually the fastest way to increase your bench press, and I mean disproportionately so compared to most of your other big lifts. And that oftentimes it's one of the first lifts to go down when you start losing body fat if you're not really careful with your training, your diet, everything else. So there's some reasons for that. Now, when you guys look at the data out there, this has been researched pretty heavily over the years, but out of the big three, researchers have found that the bench press is most heavily correlated with body weight. Meaning the bench press compared to the squat, the bench, the deadlift, has the strongest correlation with going up with increases in body weight and correlation with going down with decreases in body weight. The squat would be number 2 behind it, and the deadlift last. The deadlift is least affected by the amount you weigh. Now, for a lot of people, they would say, okay, that seems counterintuitive, right? Because the bench involves the least muscle mass out of the 3. The squat, a lot more muscle mass used in the bench press, and the deadlift uses a little more muscle than the squat does, right? A few more muscle fibers here and there, maybe 10% more through the body. But those people would say, well, shouldn't more muscle equal more strength in those? Yeah, it does, but we're not just talking about muscle mass. We're talking about body weight itself. In other words, you don't see much change up or down on deadlift strength as long as you maintain the same amount of muscle on your body, the same leverages. Your deadlift doesn't really change very much outside of muscle mass gains, meaning as far as weight goes. In other words, additional water weight, additional fat doesn't do much for the deadlift. So reason there's a lot of lighter guys who still have really strong deadlifts, right? So a lot of reasons for that. Whereas in the bench press, things like water weight, things like body fat, directly affect the lift. Now, that doesn't make sense at first. It might seem counterintuitive. People would say, well, why is it doing that? Oh, well, it's twofold in nature. In other words, the most obvious one, this should be an easy one. We're going to get to another one in a minute, though. The most obvious one is if you have more fat on your chest, more fat you have, because guys, you got to remember, fat's not just subcutaneous. There's fat inside the muscle, there's fat under the muscle. So just because you've gained a ½ inch of extra blubber over your chest, right? People are like, well, that can reduce the range of motion. Yeah, but what about the fat you gain in the muscle and the fat under the muscle? In other words, your chest comes out more. Well, what's the hardest part of the bench press? The bottom. Been proven over and over. Basic biomechanics. You're at a mechanical disadvantage the deeper you get. It's harder to lift the same weight for every inch lower that you go on the bench press. It can become dramatically harder to lift the same weight. There's a reason people can do half reps off boards sometimes with 100 or up to 200 pounds more than they can press off their chest. The reason bouncing off your chest can add an enormous amount to your bench press. It's because it's hardest at the bottom. Well, if you start trimming range of motion out of the bottom, the lift gets easier. You have to exert less force. Your muscles do not have to contract as hard to bench, say, 300 pounds, right? They do not have to contract as hard if you cut an inch out of the range of motion. Conversely, if you start losing that extra fat, the range of motion gets longer, right? So that fat alone is changing the range of motion positively or negatively. Now, people would say, well, that doesn't matter for muscle gain, though, and you guys are right. Changing the range of motion, in other words, if the range of motion gets shorter and allows you to lift more weight, it's not giving you any benefit as far as muscle growth goes because you're not increasing the tension on the muscle itself, right? The muscle is having to work slightly less hard, a fraction less hard to lift the same weight. Well, that doesn't produce better growth, so you have to add more weight to get the same stimulus. It's not really a positive effect there. But if you're trying to move the most weight, your bench is going to go up if you've gained an inch of fat that's added an extra inch to your chest. You know, again, through those 3 different areas, not just under the skin. That one makes a lot of sense. The other thing has to do with the line of pull. Now, what's interesting when we start talking about efficient lines of pull is I've seen a lot of people who mistakenly make the claim that the most efficient line of pull has the most potential for muscle mass. So not necessarily. You'll see people saying, oh, you should do one-armed cable lat pull downs because it most aligns with the fibers in the lat, so therefore they're going to get the most stimulation. No, they get the most stimulation by the most tension. And a disadvantaged angle with a lighter weight can create the same amount of tension, right? So that's not necessarily true. It's kind of bro science that a lot of people who claim to be evidence-based have tried to pull out. So there's another factor going on here. Another factor going on. And we're not even getting into the muscle growth aspects of it. That's a whole other issue as far as bulking and cutting goes. I mean, realistically speaking, is it easier to gain muscle when you're bulking or when you're cutting? I mean, this is a no-brainer for anybody out there. So that's a separate topic. We can cover a little bit more of that at the end. That's the easiest one. We're talking about when muscle mass is staying constant. So what's been noted when you look at the line of pull on the chest, the bigger your chest is, the more efficient your line of pull goes as far as the tendons up here and the pecs that insert up here. Because as the angle changes, in other words, guys like me who have a big rib cage, we have a mechanical advantage on the press out of the bottom, right? We have a mechanical advantage. Now, I have longer arms, so that takes some of that away. That puts me at a disadvantage. So I have one structural trait that gives me an advantage on the bench press, and I have another one that probably counteracts it. So, in certain ways, people say, man, you're built to bench because of your big rib cage, right? But I have really long arms. Now, a guy with really stumpy arms and a big rib cage, that guy's going to be a world champion at the bench press if he really focuses on it. He's going to compete at an ultra high level. That's the guy who's going to be able to get to a 400 bench without drugs, right? Possibly without even getting ridiculously fat. So what you need to remember is your chest goes up, particularly the bone helps a lot, but gaining muscle, anything that adds thickness to the chest starts creating more fibers that are being pushed further out that give them a more efficient line of pull on that tendon that will give you an advantage. It's a lever, it's a moment arm advantage. If you look at the levers, because it pulls at a slightly different angle in here, we're talking fractions of a degree, but that stuff starts adding up over time. Fractions of a degree. Well, what about body fat? Well, the stuff on the surface won't matter, right? But what about intramuscular fat? What about intramuscular water? What happens when you're bulking and gaining weight? You gain water in your muscles. When you cut, what happens? You drop water weight in your muscles when you're losing weight. That's part of your weight loss. It's going to be intramuscular water. Right? Simple concept. You hold less glycogen, less electrolytes, all of that in the muscles. And it's not enormous. It's not like 10% of your muscle water disappears, but we only need a fraction. We need 1%. So if you're holding more intramuscular water and fat in the muscle, it swells up. The fibers near the ends, the outer portions, are pushed further out. Therefore, they're going to get a more efficient line of pull there. What about fat under the muscle? If you're gaining fat underneath the pectorals, and if you guys have ever eaten meat, you do realize when you go take a big cut of any animal, there's marbling on both sides. There's fat on both sides of the muscle. Right? Now, we tend to hold more subcutaneously, but if you gain a little tiny amount of fat, 1/8 of an inch of fat underneath your pectorals, that raises the whole pectoral 1/8 of an inch. That will change slightly the angle of pull. So in other words, when the angle of pull is improved, the same amount of exact strength and force being produced by the pectoral will give more force of bringing the arm forward. So in other words, you'll be able to do more weight on flies, more weight on bench presses, without any additional muscle, without any additional strength, because you've created a leverage advantage. So if someone is gaining fat, they're gaining an advantage through two mechanisms mechanically that allows them to bench press more weight potentially, because they don't necessarily have to have more muscle. With the same amount of muscle and the same amount of strength, in other words, your pectoral strength wouldn't need to increase at that point. It'd be nice if it did, that would help. But even if it stayed the same, the exact same strength, you now have a mechanical advantage as far as the fiber angles that are going to allow you to bench press a tiny little bit more weight. and you're trimming the range of motion down, which is going to let you bench a tiny bit more weight. So body fat itself, particularly through the chest region, increases or decreases your bench press potential because of mechanical advantage. And this is more so on this lift than most other big lifts. So when you factor that in, why do people's bench presses tend to go down when they're losing weight? And why do they tend to go up when they're gaining weight? Well, there's a simple mechanical advantage there. Then we have the whole other issue, and this is what affects all your lifts. If you're training hard and you are eating enough to gain fat, you're probably recovering faster, you're creating a better anabolic environment for your muscle tissue, so you're going to gain muscle faster anyways. Well, if you're gaining all those other mechanical advantages and your pecs and triceps are growing, you're obviously going to get stronger on your bench. Well, the same thing when you start cutting. When you start cutting, and you oftentimes lose some muscle. That's the norm. Most people lose muscle when they cut body fat. I'm not saying you can't get around it. There are ways around it. I'm trying to do so right now. But by and large, the majority of people who lose body fat lose a little bit of muscle. Well, if you're losing both those mechanical advantages and you lose any muscle mass in your pecs and triceps, your bench is going to start going down. So when we start looking at this, people need to understand that changes in body weight itself, not just muscle mass. I mean, muscle mass absolutely matters. Don't get me wrong. It matters tremendously. Matters the most. But the fat itself, both under the muscle, inside the muscle, on the outside of the muscle, water retention in the muscle, changes the leverages on your chest exercises quite a bit. And it just has to do with the way they're inserted there. So accordingly, when it's been studied, the research has found the same thing to be true. We could look at those and create a theory of that, and then when it's been tested, the bench press is most affected by changes in body weight compared to most other big exercises. And the same would be true of virtually any chest-dominant exercise. Any exercise that uses the pectorals as a primary mover is going to experience that to some degree, but particularly ones to where the bar touches the chest, because we're adding a second mechanical change. So the bench press is right up there with that. So when people want to know why that seems to be the case, there's your answer right there. There's multiple different reasons why gaining weight causes the bench to go up pretty quickly, a lot easier, and why losing weight, your bench press can stall and in some cases regress relatively quickly. When you're trying to hold on to bench strength, when you are cutting, it is a balancing act. It's a balancing act. You have to dial everything in pretty effectively to maintain 100% of your bench press if you're going to lose, say, 20 pounds of body weight. You really need to know what you're doing at that point, because you will be getting weaker on the bench mechanically. So if you can maintain the strength, you actually have probably increased slightly. And that's the good way to look at it. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.